Eddie Lovelace was a beloved judge from Kentucky, and things were a little bit weird for him. One day he was teaching his Sunday school class like he did every weekend, and he had to stop midway because he was feeling very disoriented and confused. A few days later, he went outside to get the paper, and he started to feel really dizzy, and he couldn't feel his legs. So, of course, his daughter rushed him to the hospital. Doctors discovered that Eddie had suffered a stroke, and just 5 days later, he declined so quickly and passed away on September 17th of 2012. As we'll soon learn, he was just one of 64 people that were seemingly fine one day and were dead the next. Let's talk about the 2012 meningitis outbreak. Hi friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sydney, and if you are new here, this is just a place where we can talk about true crime, spooky, scary stories, dark history, or anything else I got going on in my brain. So things look a little bit different around here. I am finally settled into my new place, so I will be playing around with different backgrounds and things, just as a little personal update, I guess. But I am very excited to get into this story. I have been researching this for a long time, and if you are done with this video and you want more information, a more deep dive into this case, I have this amazing book. Most of my research came straight from this book. It is called Kill Shot: A Shadow Industry, A Deadly Disease by Dearen. I'm going to link it down in the description with like a little link to where you can buy it. Highly recommend. It is nonfiction, obviously, but it reads like a novel. It is crazy. This whole story is it's crazy. It just seems like it could never happen. So if you are interested, highly recommend. But without any further ado, let's get into this crazy case. So let's talk about the New England Compounding Center, or the NECC. Now, this was a compounding pharmacy that was started in 1998 by two brothers, Gregory and Douglas Congalero. And this was a family business. So the brothers passed off the day-to-day operations to their brother-in-law, and his name was Barry Caden. Okay, so you might be thinking, slow down, what is a compounding pharmacy? And there's going to be a lot of pharmaceutical jargon in this video. Don't you worry about it, girlie. Take my hand. I'm going to help you through it. You're going to be a pro by the end of this. So NECC was what is called a compounding pharmacy, which means that they specialize in making very specific kinds of medicines. And there are a multitude of different reasons why you might want to use a compounding pharmacy. For example, if you have to take a medication but you're allergic to one of its ingredients, they can easily take out that ingredient and substitute it so that you're able to take the medication. Or if you need a specific dose that is not readily available, a compounding pharmacy can make that dosage for you. There are two different types of compounding pharmacies. One that deals with sterile medications like injectables and eye drops, things like that, and another that specializes in more generic things like creams or pills. And of course, different facilities have different target buyers. So for example, some pharmacies just have specific orders that they fill for specific patients, and others operate more as like a manufacturing plant where they can sell their medications to hospitals and things like that. And hospitals and clinics will often use compounded formulas because it's cheaper than using a name brand product. So that's how specific compounding pharmacies like NECC came to be, because they were a niche necessity because people still needed their compounded formulas. So now that we have all of our background information, let's go back to the New England Compounding Center. So at first, they were just providing prescriptions to a few doctors' offices and some pain management clinics. This was their target audience, these smaller companies. But in addition, they were also providing certain products to different doctors' offices when they had emergency shortages. And this was totally legal. It was okay to send about 5% of their produced medications off to whoever needed it. But the problem was that this was not well regulated. So we don't really know if NECC was sending 5% of their produced medicines or 25%. Nobody was tracking how much was actually being shipped out. So you might be thinking, isn't there some kind of regulation for these compounding pharmacies? And yes and no. Let's talk a little bit about the FDA. The FDA stands for the U.S. Drug and Food Administration, and they regulate all of our medication in the United States. And this can include things like dosages, how much can be produced, where it can be shipped to. They also meticulously track any errors to make sure that all of the drugs that are being shipped out are safe. But this is where it all gets a little muddy, because the FDA, up until about 2013 to 2015, didn't have the same control over compounding pharmacies as they did for companies like Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer. And this basically meant that compounding pharmacies had free reign over how much they produced, how much they shipped out, everything. It was just kind of a frickin' free-for-all. And it's not like the FDA didn't understand what was going on in these compounding pharmacies. I'm sure they understood that things were probably not up to standard in these pharmacies, but they couldn't really do anything about it because although they had to register with the FDA, they weren't controlled by the FDA. Each compounding pharmacy was controlled by their own state pharmacy board. And the FDA tried to come to Congress with some updated policies and things like that in 1998, but Congress was like, nah, everything's fine. So this meant that the FDA really had no control over the compounding pharmacies. And in our case today with the NECC, technically the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy was supposed to be regularly inspecting these compounding pharmacies, making sure that everything was up to standard. But there were 48 different compounding pharmacies in Massachusetts, and the board was very, very understaffed. So they just couldn't go around to all the pharmacies and make sure that everything was up to par. On top of all of that, the Board of Pharmacy really didn't know what they were looking for when they did go to inspect these compounding pharmacies. They were used to looking at these little mom and pop places, not a facility as big as a compounding pharmacy. So the NECC, and more specifically Barry Caden, used all of this to his advantage. So by the mid-2000s, the NECC had turned from a small compounding pharmacy to basically a manufacturing facility. And Caden and the higher-ups at NECC, they had figured out the perfect plan. Think about a time that you've lied. Okay, it's okay. This is a safe space. I've done it. You've done it. Think about a time that you've lied. Maybe it was just a little fib, but then it was just easier to keep lying. And the lies kept building up until it ultimately snowballs out of control and turns into this monster that is just untamable. That is kind of what happened to the New England Compounding Center. So first, NECC was compounding medications for patients that had prescriptions filled out by their doctors. But as the demand grew and as their company became more popular, they started to reuse old patient prescriptions just to be able to produce more medication. After a while, it was easier just to have one doctor sign a bunch of prescriptions. Just have him sign once for, 100, 200 prescriptions. But then after that, they decided that they would start just making up names for prescriptions. Donald Trump, Mickey Mouse, Indiana Jones. And that's how they would do their record keeping. So it seemed like, again, they were just producing specific orders for specific patients, when in reality, they were just mass producing medications and slapping a fake patient prescription onto it. They were at this point a manufacturing facility. It started out slow. Then it spiraled out of control. One of the most popular medications being produced at NECC was an injectable steroid called methylprednisolone. I will put it up on the screen because I don't think I said that right. This medication is used to reduce joint and back pain, reduce inflammation, and although NECC made it without a preservative, it was still able to do the same thing as the name brand, and it cost a little bit less for the patient as well. At their height, NECC had orders from about 8,500 different hospitals and clinics all over the country. And why were they so popular? Because they were frickin' fast. They could get their medications out in about 3 days, whereas normal compounding pharmacies would take about a week. And you might be thinking, like, how were they so fast? That's crazy. It's because NECC was cutting corners at every chance they could. This part of the story is so frustrating to me because I am somebody that works in healthcare in a lab setting, and the way that NECC operated was just completely bonkers. So let's talk about the building itself. So NECC was built on top of an old train depot that had experienced an oil spill. So when Greg Condolero bought the property, he promised that he would clean up the oil spill, make the property nice, and as you might imagine, he was able to get this property for a lower cost because of its condition. But NECC didn't want to spend the time or the money to clean up this oil spill. So they just built their facility right on top of the oil spill without really doing anything to stop it. So, of course, as you might imagine, oil would just seep up through the floor. And so to combat this, people would just lay down trash bags over the pooling oil in the lab and in the facility itself. But that was just the foundation. We haven't even gotten to the lab of NECC. So of course, if you are making a injectable steroid, things have to be sterile, which meant that NECC had a clean room. And that meant that you have to make sure that you are sterile before you step into that room. Because if you introduce any foreign material, bacteria, anything into that room, you run the risk of contaminating your medications. To give you an idea of just how dirty NEC's clean room was, one of the company's janitors said that the rooms outside of the sterile room were much more cleanly than the actual clean room. That's not great, right? That's not good. There were often rodents scampering across the floors, bugs buzzing around the entire lab. There were cleaning logs inside of the clean room, but they were often just marked off without actually being completed. There was a lot of horseplay always going on within that clean room, and that included spraying your coworkers with chemicals or putting each other in or on different types of equipment. Even if you wanted to follow the rules, even if you really wanted to do things to standard, good luck, because they had no procedures, no policies, no formal training of any kind. It was a fucking free-for-all in NECC's clean room. For example, one of the employees that was tasked with filling the vials with this steroid, the methylpred, he was not ever formally trained on how to do this. And this is the most important part of the process because it has to be sterile. And there's a very specific procedure on how to do this correctly. And because he was the most senior tech, he was just thrown on and was just told to fill up the vials. That's how unprofessional it was within that lab. So now that you guys understand the horrors of the NECC clean room, let's talk a little bit about testing. So it's standard in the US that anytime somebody is manufacturing a medicine that's over 500 units, so 500 vials, you have to send 20 of those vials to be tested. And you're testing for any type of bacteria, any type of contaminant, anything that could hurt a patient. But the problem was that this process wasn't very well documented. So NECC would send 2 vials per 500 because they didn't want to waste their product. Then they could say, oh yes, we test every batch. They didn't include that they tested only 2 vials when they were supposed to be testing 20, but they could say, yep, we test every single one of our batches, everything's come back clean. Along with testing each batch of medication, each pharmacy should be testing their clean room, testing all of the surfaces, testing the air quality, all of that stuff, just to make sure that, again, you have a sterile environment because you're making sterile medications. There was one employee that worked for NECC, her name was Annette Robinson, and she was tasked with doing all of this testing. But she had no prior experience. She was interviewed in the parking lot. She had no experience in this, but yet she was testing NECC's clean room. So her main duties were to go around and swab all the surfaces, swab under the hood, swab, all the things, and then test the air as well. And in February of 2012, she wrote an email to the CEO of the company, Barry Caden, and to the lead pharmacist. His name was Glenn Chin. And she wrote an email saying that she found many mold-forming colonies within the clean room. And this is not the first email from Annette. Annette sent very similar emails to this almost every time she tested the clean room because there was almost always mold found within the lab. Caden and Chin responded like they always did. They were always annoyed that Annette was bringing these problems to them because they had bigger things to worry about. They had to worry about getting those drugs out on time and, making their monies, okay? But they did decide to act, so they had all of the employees spray down the clean room with this antifungal reagent. But the problem is that mold and fungi, they're strong little buggers, and it takes more than just some spray to get a clean room actually clean. What's really funny is that Caden tried to blame the mold on their cleaning services that would come in after hours, but the employees always brought in sterile equipment and always brought it back out, so that didn't make any sense. The manager of the cleaning company actually offered Caden, he said, I will come in myself, I will try to figure out what the source of this is, and if it's us, I will pay the consequences. But Caden declined. So that's interesting, if you ask me. So of course, mold can get onto surfaces in a number of different ways, but the reason that Annette was finding mold in the air, that was a different story. So it turns out that NECC's HVAC system would completely shut off at 8 p.m. So that meant that the lab would get super hot. And of course, all the lights were off because it was nighttime, creating the perfect humid, hot, and dark environment. Perfect for mold to grow, okay? And there were a number of times where the HVAC system during the day would just shut off. One time the lab got up to 105 degrees. So it's no wonder that there was mold on the surfaces, in the air. They were basically creating a breeding ground for mold and yeast to grow. Each batch of methylpred was prepared by NECC's head pharmacist, Glenn Chin. He made sure that he was doing, the proper doses, everything correctly, but it was everything after he made up the methylpred that was sketchy as fuck. So it's super duper important that if you're making a sterile medication, that you put it in an autoclave for about 20 minutes. And this just makes sure that any type of thing that could be growing in there, mold, bacteria, yeast, it gets killed. So you have no chance of getting contamination in your vial of medication. In most situations, pharmacists will put a little bioindicator into the autoclave with the medications, and it changes color to indicate, yep, you're all good. All of the living things that could be in this vial are now dead. And this is super important because, again, you're just making sure that you're taking out any contaminants that could be in your medications. At NECC, they autoclaved their medications for about 15 minutes because Barry Caden and Glenn Chin said that this increased productivity and saved time and money. Basically, they were just autoclaving to say that they did it. Another really important piece of making medication is a lot number. And lot numbers are on almost everything. They're on food, they're on obviously all of your medications, they're on a lot of different things. And that is just a very specific number from a specific batch that was made. And lot numbers affect all of us on the daily. For example, like when they have recalls of certain products like lettuce or like eggs, they use lot numbers to be like, if you're in this state, or this state, you might have bought a lot of contaminated eggs, so don't eat them. At NECC, as Glenn Chin was filling these large orders, he would have, let's say, like 500 vials, and he mixed a big batch of methylpred, filled all the vials up, and realized that he was like 5 short. So he would mix up just another little small batch and finish filling his 500 vials, which you have 2 different like concoctions in one big batch. So let's say that those last 5 vials that he filled had contaminants in them. Well, now the whole entire lot is going to be flagged as being contaminated. So he was basically just mixing lots up together, which is super duper dangerous. But none of these shortcomings seemed to bother Barry Caden or Glenn Chin or anybody else at NECC because they were bringing in the big bucks. In 2004, their revenue was $5 million. 3 years later, it was $13.1 million. And in 2012, their revenue was $27.4 million. So all of these things, the clean room not being sterile, the mold being found almost every time it was tested for it, the lot numbers not matching up, people not being trained, all of it didn't matter because they were making a lot of money and they were getting slaps on the wrist whenever they did fuck up. The first red flag that NECC maybe wasn't the best compounding pharmacy in the world actually happened all the way back in May of 2002. At least 5 people had meningitis-like symptoms after receiving steroid injections that were produced by NECC. The FDA was actually able to launch an investigation in this case, and they found open containers on the countertops, little to no record keeping, and they simply just weren't up to standard. Barry Caden was very compliant at first, answering all their questions, giving them all the paperwork that they might need, but Soon he got his lawyers involved, and afterwards there was just no communication between FDA and NECC. As the year progressed, more and more people were getting sick, and the FDA was called again. And their hands were tied because they couldn't really do anything at this point. So they contacted the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy, and they were like, hey, please talk to NECC, tell them to get their shit together. We suggest that you make them stop producing medications for now. The Massachusetts board relayed this information to Barry Caden, and in response, he promised that he would do better. He said, I'm so sorry. They got new lab equipment, they expanded their lab, and they also hired a new pharmacist. And so the Massachusetts board was like, you're good, girl. You keep doing you, okay? And that was basically the end of it. Funnily enough, around this time, the Massachusetts board actually decided that they were going to make this committee because of the growing popularity of compounding pharmacies. So this committee was supposed to be specifically for compounding pharmacies so that, they could make sure that regulations were happening. Everybody could be on the same page, which in theory is great. All the minds coming together to make it better for the industry. But the problem was that people in the business, like, for example, Barry Caden himself was on this committee, it was obviously a huge conflict of interest. Like, nothing was getting done on this committee. Basically, everything stayed the same, and NECC kept just mass producing medications. NECC was able to stay off the radar until about 2004. When the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy started to get complaints from doctors' offices in South Dakota and Wisconsin and Iowa. They were complaining that NECC was sending out medications without the proper prescriptions. And some doctors' offices were cool with it, but others knew that this wasn't the correct policy, and they were a little bit nervous about it. The Massachusetts Board again reached out to Barry Caden, and they were like, hey, dude, don't do that. And he was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I promise to do better. We are going to do so much better. I'm so sorry. And again, that was good enough. In 2012, a sales representative from NECC was talking to the director of pharmacy at one of their hospitals that they source their medications to in New York. When the pharmacist asked how NECC was able to send out such large batches of prescriptions, the sales representative told them that, they just back order the prescriptions and it all just works out. And the pharmacist was like, that's definitely against guidelines. I don't think you guys should be doing that. The sales representative, now being a little bit confused because he didn't really know all the ins and outs of regulations and the FDA, he brought his concerns to Barry Caden. And here is what Barry Caden had to say about all of this. This guy, the pharmacist, is a douche. FDA has nothing to do with compounding regulations. This was all solved and explained years ago. Based on his comments, he is really clueless. So if you had any doubts about how the CEO of NECC really felt, he didn't care. He didn't care that he was breaking the law. He didn't care that all of this was truly not really up to standard. He just didn't really give a fuck. In March of that same year, NECC was shipping out batches of this eye blocker to the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Hospital. And basically what the eye blocker does is when it's put into the patient's eye, it makes the area numb so that they can do procedures and things like that. The Massachusetts Eye and Ear Hospital reached out to NECC because lots of patients were complaining that the eye blocker wasn't working and they were feeling a lot of pain during procedures. They reached out just being a concerned client, like, what can we do? And one of the sales representative was like, it's probably you guys. You guys are taking out the medication and warming it up to room temperature. You can't be doing that. It has to come straight out of the refrigerator and go directly into the patient's eyeball in order for it to work. And this was strange to the staff at the hospital because they had always taken out the eye blocker and warmed it up to room temp. It was just more comfortable to put it into the patient's eye if it was not cold. But they followed NECC's directions and tried to just take it out of the fridge and put it into the patient's eye. But patients were still complaining of pain. At this point, the hospital was getting kind of fed up, so they decided on their own accord to ship some of the eye blockers out to be tested. And it turns out that there was not the correct dose in the eye blocker, so they were giving patients ineffective medication. So instead of reaching back out to NECC, the hospital just decided to file a formal complaint with the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy. And the pharmacy came and did a office inspection where they looked through all of NECC's records, all of their prescriptions, and for some reason, I don't know how, but they didn't see anything wrong with any of NECC's record keeping. I don't even know how that's possible because, again, they were backfiling prescriptions. They had multiple prescriptions for one signature. They had fake names going on. But the Massachusetts board was like, no, you guys are all good. Good job. So again, NECC was flying under the radar. Let's focus for a minute on the St. Thomas Outpatient Neurosurgical Clinic. They often ordered large batches of methylpred from NECC. Originally, they just were running into shortages of the name brand, so they decided to try a compounding pharmacy. But since they were getting their product much faster and it was cheaper for both the clinic and the patients, St. Thomas just became a regular client of NECC. At this clinic, they did about 15 to 20 lumbar epidural injections per day, and this amounted to about 160 procedures per week. So they were doing a lot of business for NECC. It was April of 2012, and 55-year-old Thomas Rubinski was feeling really crummy, but he thought he just had a sinus headache, nothing more. But as the days ticked by, he was suddenly getting a lot of brain fog, he had flu-like symptoms, so his wife convinced him to go to the hospital. They decided to admit him and just pump him full of antibiotics, and this seemed to make all of the symptoms completely disappear. He was feeling tip-top shape. So the doctor sent him home, but just a few days later, he had declined very, very quickly. And now his wife was rushing him to the ER because he was having slurred speech. He was once again admitted to the hospital, this time to the ICU, and he slipped in and out of consciousness while his tests were being run and resulted. And just a few days later, his spinal fluid culture came back, and it turns out that Thomas had fungal meningitis. And the culprit was a little-known bug called Aspergillus fumigatus. So A. fumigatus is a fungus that is pretty rare to find within the human body. It's really only found in immunocompromised people. And by all accounts, Thomas was healthy as a horse, besides his back pain. And this fungus is all around us all the time in the environment. It's in the soil, it's in the air, and it usually doesn't cause any problems. But now, this healthy-ish man had fungal meningitis caused by this fungus. So doctors were scratching their heads. They had to figure out how this man contracted this disease. As you can imagine, the Center for Disease Control immediately got involved because, again, this case was so weird that they had to figure out what had caused it. After doing some digging, the CDC found out that Thomas Rubinski had been going to the St. Thomas Outpatient Clinic for steroid back injections. And so they reached out to St. Thomas Clinic and asked them if they had ever had any problems with fungus or mold within their facility. And the manager was like, no, we haven't. What's going on? And so when the CDC kind of filled them in a little bit, the manager informed the CDC that they had had a couple more patients that had come to the clinic reporting a stiff neck, headaches, which are signs of meningitis. So the CDC hung up the phone and realized that this might not just be a freak case, this might be a full-on outbreak. While the CDC continued on with their investigation, the head doctor at St. Thomas's outpatient clinic started to do some digging of his own, and he started by reaching out to a sales representative at NECC. He asked for all of the mold and fungus test results that had been done on this lot that he had been shipped of methylpred. And as he received the results, he realized everything was clear. There was no contamination within this lot. But just to be safe, the sales representative came out to St. Thomas's outpatient clinic to talk to this head doctor. And the doctor grilled him. Have you had any other hospitals, clinics, patients report any signs of meningitis? Do you guys test for A. fumigatus? Anything and everything the doctor could think of, he asked the sales representative. And he ensured the doctor that everything was tested. They hadn't had any problems. Everything was peachy keen over at NECC. And the doctor was satisfied with these answers, and he moved on with his investigation. He decided that he would look into the needles that they used to give these back injections, because obviously the medication itself wasn't the problem. Feeling relieved, the sales representative left this meeting with the doctor feeling really good about everything, And so he emailed Barry Caden and was like, this meeting went super well, everything is going good. And Caden shot back an email that was like, don't contact this doctor anymore, send everything to me, I need to handle this situation. Red flag. But the sales representative was like, sick, sweet, I did a good job. When they were talking later in person, Barry Caden evidently said to the sales representative, it's us, it's all over. This is my worst nightmare. So by this point, Barry knew that it was his medication. He knew that it was contaminated. And he didn't do anything about it. He didn't come clean. He didn't say, hey guys, it's us. Barry's only saving grace is that he did decide to take all of the methylpred that hadn't been shipped out from this contaminated lot. He decided to quarantine it in an office space so that it wasn't going to get shipped out and more people weren't going to be hurt. So although St. Thomas's outpatient clinic was satisfied that NECC wasn't to blame, the CDC, the FDA, and the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy, they weren't so sure. So on September 26 of 2012, the Massachusetts board came to do an inspection of NECC. One of the inspectors noticed all of the quarantined vials in that office space, and they noted that by the amount of medicine just in this room, that they were more in line with a manufacturing facility instead of a compounding pharmacy. Again, this is a giant red flag, but I will give them some slack because, again, the Massachusetts board had so much on their plate. They had to look over so many different pharmacies and they didn't really know what they were looking for. So they did note it, but it didn't really strike a chord with them. Barry Caden gave the inspectors all of the backfilled prescriptions. Again, they didn't see anything wrong with it for some fucking reason, and the inspectors couldn't go inside of NECC's clean room because they weren't properly trained to do so. I don't even know why the board wanted to do an inspection because they did a shit job. I'm trying to give the pharmacy board some slack, but they really dropped the ball so many times. They really did desk audits so many times. They looked over the prescription so many times. They didn't see anything wrong with it. But during this inspection, they did write down all the sketchy things they saw, and this time they decided to ask the FDA for help. It only took, 4 or 5 times, but they did ask the FDA, so kudos to you on that one. It wasn't easy for the FDA to get approval to even do an inspection of the facility. They had to get approval, and the NECC lawyers had to talk to the FDA lawyers, but finally they got everything figured out so that the FDA was allowed to enter the facility. The FDA started their inspection of NECC on October 1st of 2012, and the first thing they noted is that when they looked at the quarantined vials of methylpred, that the medication looked cloudy, like there was debris within the medication. They, much like the pharmacy board, took a look at all of the prescriptions, looked over everything, and they also decided, because they were able to go in the clean room, they were trained, they were authorized to do so, they took samples of all of the surfaces, the air, everything they could. By the 3rd day of the inspection, the lawyers had duked it out, and the FDA was authorized to have 98 vials of the contaminated methylpred to test. They were finally going to be able to confirm that NECC was the culprit behind this fungal meningitis outbreak. They had to work extremely fast because at this point, they had figured that about 13,500 people had been exposed to this contaminated lot of methylpred. And the people that were getting sick, they had a 40 to 50% mortality rate. So multiple lives were on the line. So St. Joseph's Hospital in Michigan was the hotspot for exposed patients to go. By this point, they had about 153 patients that had been exposed to contaminated methylpred, and they were seated in their own little special wing of the hospital. That's how crazy this outbreak was, that they just contained everybody in their own little wing of the hospital. The doctors realized that the fungal meningitis patients had the fungus growing directly on their spine. So they had to decide if they were going to try to operate on these patients, give antibiotics, or if they wanted to do a fun little mixture of both. And they decided that if they were going to have the most amount of people survive, that they had to hit it hard. So they decided to do a combination of surgery and meds. And this is like the craziest part of the story to me, and I don't know why every time I think about it, I kind of get chills. But the type of surgery that these doctors were performing was completely unprecedented. They were kind of winging it. This had never been done before. Basically, they were just going in and scraping fungus off of the patient's spinal cord, which is crazy. They were just digging in there, just trying to get all of the fungus out of the patient's body. The procedure took about 3 hours per patient, and all in all, they performed this surgery on 116 people without knowing if it was helping them or hurting them. Along with the surgery, the CDC was recommending that doctors prescribe this very aggressive antibiotic called voriconazole. This antibiotic can cause kidney, liver, and pancreatic damage, but it also can cause hallucinations, nausea, hair loss. And it was kind of a slippery slope because they had to kind of think about quality of life or life at all. And a lot of times they did choose to prescribe this antibiotic because they didn't really have a lot of options at that point. 5 days after those vials were taken out of NECC, the CDC found out that almost all of those vials had both mold and yeast growing within them. 11 out of the 41 samples taken from NECC's clean room had both mold and yeast in them. By October 30th of 2012, the CDC was able to figure out what fungus was growing within the vials of methylpred. And funnily enough, it wasn't A. fumigatus. Tom Rubinski was patient 0, but for some reason, A. fumigatus wasn't in these vials. It was actually a fungus called Exerholum rostratum. I'm going to put that on the screen. I do not know how to pronounce that. I was trying so hard. I'm sorry, man. Anyway, much like A. fumigatus, this fungus is found very commonly in the soil, in the grass, in the air, and it also loves humid conditions and climates. It's also a super reproducer and a super spreader in the right conditions. What's interesting is that if for some reason the medication had been given orally, the stomach acid of the patient would have just broken up that fungus and it wouldn't have mattered. But because the methylpred was a steroid injection and it was put directly into the patient's body, this little fungus was able to thrive within the human body. Not only did it have the perfect temperature and condition to grow at this point, but also the methylpred was still working, and this steroid is an immune suppressor. The patient's immune system was down, so this fungus had room to spread and grow freely without the body getting involved. The CDC was now positive of 2 things. 1, NECC was responsible for this outbreak. Their conditions, their medications were all contaminated. And 2, this fungal meningitis outbreak was caused by this fungus, E. rostratum. Now, the CDC had to figure out what was next, because at this point, they had over 17,000 vials shipped out to 23 different states. All in all, 753 people across 20 states had been diagnosed with fungal meningitis. And of those patients, 64 of them had died. They knew the culprit, and now somebody had to pay. Let's talk about the 2 absolute powerhouse prosecutors that decided to pursue this case. Their names were Amanda Strawn and George Fergus. They were both U.S. attorneys that were working in the healthcare fraud unit. They spent over a year poring over all of the documents and correspondence between Barry Caden, Glenn Chin, and all of the other higher-ups at NECC. They decided that they were, of course, going to go for murder charges, but they were also going to go for something called RICO. And I didn't know what RICO was, okay? So if you don't, I'm gonna explain it a little bit, okay? So RICO stands for Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations. And most times people are charged with this if they are doing some sort of fraud. So for example, some people that have been charged with RICO have been Donald Trump, Sean Diddy Combs, people like that, okay? So they were going to use this RICO charge against Barry Caden, Glenn Chin, all of the people at NECC that they could possibly hit with this charge. They were going to do it. They obviously only cared about profit. They didn't give a fuck about patients. They didn't give a fuck about clinics. They only cared about how can we make the most amount of money in the quickest amount of time possible. So in September of 2014, Glenn Chin booked a flight from Boston to Hong Kong for him, his wife, his mother-in-law, and his children. This destination was extremely intentional because Hong Kong doesn't have to extradite people back to the United States if they don't want to. So this meant that Strawn and Vargas had to act really quickly. They filed a criminal complaint against Glenn Chin for some mail fraud related to NECC. They brought it up to a judge and he quickly signed an arrest warrant for Glenn Chin. Officials apprehended him right after he got through security at the airport. He was arrested and released on a $50,000 bond. Glenn claimed that this was just a very innocent trip to go to a friend's wedding. But thankfully, the feds and everybody involved in this case took this attempt to flee very seriously. In November of 2014, Vargas and Strawn relayed all of their facts and findings to the U.S. Attorney General. They just told it like it was. They told them about NEC's neglect, the deaths, the torment that the victims and their families went through. They also laid out their plan for justice. They were going to put 25 counts of second-degree murder against Barry Caden, Glenn Chin, the Congaleros family, and a few other pharmacists within NECC. They were also going to be charging Caden and Chin with RICO, and the Attorney General immediately approved the case on the spot. In December, Barry Caden was also taken into custody, although his arrest was much more low-key than Glenn Chin was. His lawyer basically knew all of the ins and outs of the arrest, and he was like, on this day, on this Wednesday, you are going to be arrested, so just be prepared. So Barry Caden was looking all expectant when the FBI came up to his door. So not very exciting, but Barry was arrested. In January of 2017, Barry Caden's trial began, and he was getting charged with 97 felonies and the 25 counts of second-degree murder. And of course, if he were to be convicted, he would be facing life in prison. The prosecutors very heavily focused on the victims and their families. They wanted the jury to hear each one of these patients' stories because Barry Caden's neglect had affected each one of their lives in a very different way. They also talked about, of course, how the NECC was not following standards of any kind. The defense really didn't care about the felony charges. They only wanted to make sure that Barry was found not guilty for the murder charges. So they really hammered home that Barry Caden didn't murder 25 people. He didn't go around stabbing all of these people. He was just one of the cogs in the machine of a bad industry. The trial lasted well over 2 months, and when the jury was finally let loose, some of those jurors had very strong opinions. They agreed with the defense. They were like, I don't think Barry Caden meant to kill 25 people. I think it just, things got out of hand, and again, he was just one person. So the jury had to make some tough decisions, but after 3 days, they had finally reached a verdict. In a somewhat surprising turn of events, Barry Caden was charged with 27 felony counts of racketeering and mail fraud, but was found not guilty for all of the second-degree murder charges. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison and $82 million of restitution for the victims. If you're like me, you might be thinking, what? What the fuck? What's going on? You're not alone, okay? But it later came out that the jury didn't understand the directions that they were given. The jurors thought that if everybody couldn't agree on a guilty verdict, that it would automatically have to be a not guilty verdict, which isn't true. If the jury doesn't agree, that's okay. It can be a hung jury, and that can spark a new trial. And it's super sketchy because on the verdict slip, there was numbers and writing in the margins. And this should have prompted the judge when he was reading the slip to be like, what's going on, right? But he never did. The judge never really wanted Barry Caden to be charged with murder. He thought that trying to convict this man of murder was silly. He never even wanted it on the table. So he probably didn't want to kind of probe the jury on what was going on, because I think he kind of wanted this trial to be done and over with. And since it agreed with what he thought the charges would be, he didn't say anything. And since Barry Caden had been tried for all of these second-degree murder charges, he could never be retried again. So the prosecutors really felt like they had failed and that this murderer was just going free. But thankfully, in 2021, an appeals court met and relooked at this case, and they found out that the judge had miscalculated the sentence. So Barry Caden's sentence was actually upped to 14.5 years. So, yay! Justice, kind of. Glenn Chin's trial took place later in 2017, and he was charged with the following: racketeering conspiracy, mail fraud, and introduction of misbranded drugs into interstate commerce with the intent to defraud and mislead. He was also charged with the 25 counts of second-degree murder, but much like Barry Caden, he was found guilty of some of the felonies, but not guilty for the murders, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. So I wanted to figure out, where are these men now? Where are Caden and Chin now? And here's what I found. So the past year, in 2024, the state of Michigan tried both Caden and Chin for 11 counts of manslaughter that occurred within the state of Michigan. Both men pleaded no contest, and Caden was charged with 10 to 15 years, and Chin was sentenced to 7.5 to 15 years served concurrently. So at the same time as their original sentences. But it's great that they are getting some additional time and finally are being charged with murder, because that's what they did. They intentionally murdered people. And yay, we love when people get to face their consequences. I am so happy that the state of Michigan was like, this is not going to fly. Not in the good state of Michigan, my friend. So you could probably imagine this, but NECC filed for bankruptcy way back in December of 2012, and this was in response to over 400 different lawsuits put against them. It was decided that the former company would pay about $200 million to the victims and their families, and the NECC building is still standing to this day, although now it is a secondhand furniture store. Let's talk a little bit about the victims that were affected by this, because obviously 64 people died, but the people that did survive, they are still struggling to this day. Some have physical ailments from the infection, others have to take medicine daily just to stay healthy. One man had to stay 209 days in the hospital and racked up $4 million in medical bills. What's crazy is the CDC did a study on these surviving patients, and it turns out that 43% of them are still on antifungals and have trouble with walking or back pain, or they have both. And 87% of the patients that completed this study are still having lasting pain to this day. The Drug Quality and Supply Act was signed in 2013 as a direct response to the NECC fungal meningitis outbreak. This bill incentivized compounding pharmacies to register with the FDA. Again, still not a requirement, but the FDA will then promote those registered compounding pharmacies to hospitals and clinics. Another component of this bill is that there's better tracking and monitoring of compounding medications, just to make sure that if something like this were to ever happen again, that they could nip it in the bud. This case was so crazy. I just can't believe that almost 1,000 people over 23 states were impacted by this thing, and I really knew nothing about it. It happened only about a decade ago, and I was like flipping through the pages of this book, just like glued to the pages, because I was like, how did we let this happen? How did we let this happen? The amount of times that NECC just slipped through the cracks. Like, how many times did the Massachusetts board inspect this company and nothing happened? The FDA tried to get involved, nothing happened. But if you get nothing else from this video, if you do happen to need a compounding pharmacy, just try to get information, try to go to a reputable source. You can figure out what ingredients are in your medications, ask how they differ, ask what their sterilization process is. You can't ask too many questions. And I feel like that goes for anything medical related. Always make sure that you're asking questions. Always make sure that you're advocating for yourself. I'm gonna go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Feel free to like, subscribe, comment if you did. If you didn't, I'm sorry. Please don't hate me. I don't know. But yeah, I'm gonna go. So please be safe out there, guys. Drink your water. Make sure that you're getting enough sunlight. It is so dreary and horrible out there. Winter's hitting super hard. So just make sure that you're taking care of yourselves, okay? Thanks again for watching. Keep being the bad bitches that you are. Bye, guys.